Today I want to talk about when a person does something that seems relatively innocuous. They just want to relax. They just want to go outside and play a little bit. Especially when you're young. When you're really young, you go outside and you want to play around and you run really fast through all the puddles and you splash in them, and maybe you play some baseball and the field is a little muddy and so you slip and you fall, and at the end of it, you're completely covered in mud and muck. And you never planned to do that. It was not your intention to go out and get extremely dirty. And when you walk up to your front door and your mom cries, "Oh, what happened?" and you're forced to strip down and get in the bath directly without somehow managing to get anything on the floor, and everything has to be cleaned. Today's story is about one such individual, a man named David who took a bath. David was called a man after God's own heart by God himself. David was raised to such authority in Israel that he was made the king. Now, David commanded the armies, and they were going out and expanding the territory of Israel. And in this particular instance, David, for whatever reason, maybe he was tired, maybe he was disappointed in all the fighting, maybe he was just lazy. But instead of going out to fight with his men, instead of being the commanding leader of his army, David stayed back and he rested while the men were out fighting. David didn't stay back to do anything mischievous. All he wanted to do was stay back. And while he was lounging about, beautiful day, looking out at the city, he saw a young woman, and she was bathing. She was taking a bath, and her name was Bathsheba. And this chick was smoking. She was gorgeous. And because she was taking a bath, big surprise, she was kinda naked. So David took a Bathsheba. He called her up to his castle, because that's what kings do. Kings really, they've only got one move. They're just like, "Hey, I'm a king, come to my castle." It makes the panties drop. So he sleeps with this woman, and she conceives a child. It turns out that this woman has a husband. So we see David just wanted to stay back while his men fought, and he fell into this situation, and he got a little dirtier. So he finds out that she has a husband, and not just any husband, because, let's face it, she's a fine woman. She could probably get any great man. I mean, she landed the king pretty easily. And so it turns out her husband is one of a group of people called David's mighty men. And there's a great chapter in the Bible, I encourage you to read it, about these mighty men. They are astounding individuals. And what they're known for is just amazing feats of battle strength. And they are his most trusted men in the entirety of his army, and there's about 12 of them. And one of these men is named Uriah. So David, after he finds out that Bathsheba is pregnant, he says, "Oh shit! I'm going to have to do something about this." And after he says, "Oh shit," he calls for Uriah, who obviously isn't sitting back and relaxing while the army is fighting, because he's part of the army. He sends for Uriah, and he has him come home. Just come home. He doesn't give him any specific orders. He just says, "Come home." And Uriah is such a stand-up guy, such a noble guy, that rather than doing what David did in the first place, rather than just saying, "Well, I'm going to relax while my men are fighting," he thinks to himself, "How can I go home? How can I be with my wife while my men are in trouble, while my men are in danger?" And so David, he hears that he doesn't go home, that he sleeps out on the street. And so David takes it a step further. He tries to get Uriah drunk. And Uriah winds up sleeping in the servants' quarter, but he does not go home to his wife. And so, since David doesn't see any particular way out of this, because Uriah doesn't give him a chance because he's such a stand-up guy, David, he sends a letter with Uriah to the commander of the army, Joab. In this letter he says, "Joab, Send Uriah out into the fiercest area of the battle, and then pull your men back so that he dies. And of course this happens. Joab follows the orders, he sends Uriah out, pulls his men back, and Uriah dies. Now Bath, Uriah's wife, well, she mourned her husband. But after she mourned her husband, David sent for her because he's still king, and, what could she do? And David married her, and of course, some time passed. But God was not pleased. He wasn't about to just put up with this from someone, a man after God's own heart. He wasn't just going to settle for this kind of behavior. And so God sent his prophet, and at this time, his prophet was Nathan. And Nathan comes to David just like a friend, and he tells him a little story. He says there's a man, this rich man, and he's got a guest coming, and he wants to prepare this nice meal for his guest. Sweet lamb, just this delicious meal. But instead of going out into the field and slaughtering one of his own lambs, this rich man, he just goes over to a poor man's field who only has one lamb to his entire name, and he slaughters that lamb, and he makes it into this nice meal for the guests that he's got coming. And hearing this story, David jumps up and he says, that man should face a terrible punishment. He should face the worst punishment ever. How could you do something to somebody who had so little when you had so much? And Nathan, he locks his jaw and he looks at David and he says, that man is you. That is what you did with Bathsheba. And then Nathan, who had obviously been speaking with God, he was moved by the Spirit, he told David that God had great punishment for him. That though David had tried to do this, all of this nefarious crap, he had tried to do this in secret. Well, God was not going to do what he had to do in secret. He was going to make David's punishment public. He was going to make it available for everyone to see just how terrible what David had done was. And God told David through Nathan the prophet that the child which Bathsheba was pregnant with will die. And David, he responded in the only way a man can. David responded in extreme mourning. He ripped his clothes, he put on this terribly itchy fabric, he wore basically nothing except that, and he wept and mourned and prayed for hours and hours on end. And the people would come to him and they'd ask him about various matters of state because he was still the king, and they just could not get his attention. He would not listen to them. He remained in absolute, utter mourning. Now, I can't tell you specifically what was on David's mind. It's somewhat easy when you don't do anything wrong and things go badly, because you know that it wasn't your fault. But what David was going through here, he knew, started with that simple desire to not go off to war with his men, to stay home and to relax a bit. He didn't want to do anything evil. He just didn't want to do what was right. And it turned into all of this. I cannot imagine the mourning that David went through. The child died, and when the child died, the counselors who had gone to David tried to get his attention. Well, they were afraid. They thought, if he was this inconsolable when the child was alive, it's going to break him to learn that the child has died. But when David found out that the child had died, he stopped mourning. He ate, he saw to his affairs, he did what needed to be done. The men asked, what is this, that you would be so inconsolable? And now that the child is dead, you seem to be just fine. And David responded, maybe I could have given God a reason to show me grace. Perhaps I could have changed his mind, but only while the child lived. You see, David had taken a bath. He had cleaned himself in his mourning. He had got all the way in to the deepest parts of himself, and he had made sure that they were no longer dirty, because he knew that it was his responsibility, it was his fault that this terrible string of events had occurred. It was his fault that his new wife was without a child. It was his fault that his child was gone. It was his fault that Uriah had died. And David knew this. And so instead of crying in anger at how unfairly he was being treated by God, instead of shouting about how the blame should have been on him specifically, he put all of his energy in trying to overturn the evil he had wrought. Now, if you're interested in this story, I truly encourage you to go and read this story for yourself. And if you like the way that I have shared this story with you, and you'd like me to continue, express your thoughts about it, let me know in the comments below. Subscribe to my page. If you can, help me out on Patreon so that this content can continue to be made.